Alright, so now for the database, creating a Mongoose connection in, like, just using vanilla JavaScript or without using any kind of framework is really, really simple. You just do, like, the basic, like, mongoose.connect, and then you pass in some of the connection variables. In Next, it's a bit different because a lot of the like connection code, like creating the Mongoose connection, would be run multiple times, like on every new render or new API request. And so because of that, there's some boilerplate code that goes into like caching the Mongoose connection. So essentially, the boilerplate code for creating the Mongoose or the Mongoose connection is essentially just like checking to see if the connection already was made, and if it is, then use that connection instead. Otherwise, create the new connection. And so if I pull that up in this window here, this is the connect database file. So this is all of the code that's responsible for creating the Mongoose connection. And I'm not gonna lie, I don't. A lot of this is actually on the nextjs documentation. So this really is like the boilerplate code provided to us by Next. I had to modify it a little bit because it was slightly outdated. So this is the current up-to-date boilerplate code for creating a Mongoose connection in Next.js. All that I really modified was just adding this line here, which just honestly don't know what it does, but the output console and the internet told me that I had to add this, so I added it. And I think that's actually all that I did. But basically, all it's doing is creating this global variable for the Mongoose connection. So when we call the database connect function, it will first check to see if that connection exists. If it does, then it'll return that. If it doesn't, then it just does the standard mongoose.connect with our database URI and the options. And then it will just wait for that promise to fulfill itself. So this is an async function, so we just have to make sure that when we're calling dbconnect that we're doing it inside of an async function and we're awaiting that before we do anything. So that's just another important thing to note. And so yeah, now, so we will actually have to call this function every single time before we make a API request to our database, and so that's kind of what I was talking about earlier with creating middleware for that, so that we don't have to manually call this dbconnect function and then make the request. So the middleware that I have inside of my kind of template project here is with database connect, and so this is essentially just middleware for my APIs that basically will just call this connect function. It will put all of the models from that database inside of the request object, and it'll also put the like database API itself inside of the request object, and then it just returns that request object back to the API handlers. So if we go inside of where is it? If we go inside of pages, API, and so I have a creatures endpoint for my API. If I go in here, you can see that I'm actually exporting not just the handler, but I'm saying with dbconnect, so I'm passing this entire handler to that middleware. And so that allows me to do things like, access models and all of that other stuff. So I'm deconstructing models, DB, and all that stuff from the request object, and I'm getting these things, models specifically, and DB from this with dbconnect middleware right here, where I'm like assigning models and DB. So that's where that's coming from. I'll get into like more of that later. we don't really have to worry about that too much right now, because we're going to be doing the back end kind of later on. It seems like more complicated than it really is. Like, I'll make more videos kind of breaking this down, and obviously we can talk more about it in person, but it's not that bad once you actually like get into it. So that'll be something to look forward to, I think. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, I'm just going to go ahead and create the connect database file .tsx. And again, that is just this file right here, which is the nextjs boilerplate for connecting to Mongoose. So I'm just going to copy all of this, put it into here. Again, you'll see some red lines just because of TypeScript. We'll worry about that later, but that's fine. So that's all good to go. And just another convention, I think, having our models folder, our Mongoose models inside of the database file is also just, you know, a good practice for file structure. I wouldn't put models inside of the global directory just because it's only related specifically to our database. So I'm also just going to come in here in the database folder and just create a new one called models. And we don't really have any models yet. User is probably going to be one of those that maybe I can just kind of copy and paste in there as an example, because I do have an example user here, which just is creating a user that has a username, an email, and a password in our database. And I was going to use bcrypt. That's kind of beyond the scope of this. Another important thing, though, that I just want to add is that since, like I said before, the way that Next works is that with our API calls, since those API calls will be ran multiple times, and like all of our database connection stuff still exists prior to those calls, we don't want to, if we're importing a model inside of our component every single time the component re-renders, or every single time we make a API request, we don't want to just export a new instance of this model, because all of this code will be run every single time we make an API request. So we don't want to create a new model every single time that we make a request. So at the end of all of our model files, instead of just exporting mongoose.model, it should be exporting first. This is just the basic, like, kind of ternary-ish operator. Basically, it's just saying it's going to check to see if that model already exists inside of Mongoose, and if it does, then it'll return that. Otherwise, it will create the actual model and then return that new model. So it's essentially a way of caching the models that have already been created, just in this like one line right here. So it's saying return an existing Mongoose model user, or return a new instance of this Mongoose model. And this is what that operator is right here, the OR operator. So it'll just return whatever operand is evaluated as true. So yeah, so inside of like all of these models here, you'll see that I have that same expression at the end of all of the default exports. So we just want to make sure that we're doing that. Otherwise, every single time we make an API call, it'll create that model again and it'll throw an error. So yeah, I think I'm just going to go ahead and use the user model just as an example. So it'll just be there for reference if we want to look at it later. So this is back inside of our project folder. So I'll just go inside of models, create a new file, do user.tsx, or not tsx, just ts. I just realized this connect db should also just be .ts. Okay, so then I'm just gonna go to user.ts, paste that. So we have a user model reference ready to go. The connect database file is good to go. Can get that out of here. I'm gonna go ahead and delete the search bar. We'll probably add a search bar, but just for now, just to remove clutter, I'll just go ahead and remove that. Same with buttons. And same with the about. But I'm going to keep page components because I think that should be there right out of the box.